In the winter of 1997 and 98, a super El Niño drove a convoy of storms into California, soaked Texas and the Gulf, and was tied to more than $5 trillion in losses worldwide. That same ocean pattern is forming again right now, and some models say this one could be even stronger. The water in the Pacific is almost across the line. In the next 20 minutes, I'll show you what a super El Niño does to America, and the one reason this one might not follow the script. Right now, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the single largest natural force in the planet's climate is switching on, and most of the country has no idea it is happening. El Niño is back. The warm phase of the Pacific that reorganizes weather across the entire globe has pulled out of its cool side, climbed through neutral, and is now sitting right on the threshold of arrival. And the forecasts say this one could be big. Not just an ordinary El Niño, but a rare super El Niño, the most powerful category, one the world has only seen 3 times since 1980. The question is no longer whether it is coming, it is how hard it hits, and whether America is anywhere near ready for it. Here is the number that matters. Scientists track this cycle with an index called the Oceanic Niño Index, and the line that officially defines El Niño is positive 0.5 degrees Celsius. As of this spring, that index has climbed to positive 0.48. That is 1/100th of a degree below the line. The Pacific is standing on the doorstep of El Niño with its hand against the door. And below the surface, a giant pool of warmer than normal water has been building for months and is now rising up, which is the classic fingerprint of an event that is loaded and about to break into the open. The agencies that watch this ocean for a living have stopped hedging. The United States Climate Prediction Center now puts the odds of El Niño forming this summer at about 82%. And the odds that it is still here, fully developed, in the heart of next winter, at about 96%. The World Meteorological Organization has told governments to prepare. The United Nations warned this month that El Niño is, in their words, arriving on our doorstep. When the UN starts using the word doorstep about the Pacific Ocean, the time for treating this as a maybe is over. But coming and catastrophic are 2 different things, and the gap between them is the whole story. There is an ordinary version of this that comes and goes every few years. And then there is the rare version, the super version, the one that floods half a continent while it dries out the other, the one tied historically to tens of thousands of deaths and trillions of dollars in damage around the world. This time, that version is genuinely on the table. So let me show you what separates the two, and then exactly what a super El Niño does when it reaches the United States. The word super is not marketing. It is a specific category measured by the temperature of the ocean. Scientists rate these events by how far the Central Pacific has warmed above its long-term average. A weak El Niño runs 0.5 to 0.9 degrees above normal. A moderate one runs 1.0 to 1.4. A strong one runs 1.5 to 2.0. And then there is the top of the scale, the one with no ceiling, the super category, which is anything above 2.0 degrees Celsius. 2 whole degrees, smeared across a stretch of ocean larger than any nation on Earth. It does not sound like much as a single number, but spread across that much water, it is enough heat to bend the jet stream and reorganize the weather of continents. Here is why that word carries weight. Since 1980, the Pacific has only crossed that 2-degree line 3 times. 3 events in over 4 decades. This is a generational kind of disturbance, and every single time one has happened, it has left a mark on the world large enough that people still study it today. So when forecasters start reaching for the word super now, about an event that has not even fully formed, they are telling you the Pacific may be about to do something it has only done 3 times in living memory. Put that rarity in human terms. If you are in your 40s, you have lived through exactly 3 of these in your entire life. And you were probably too young to remember the first. They are not annual weather. They are landmark events, the kind people anchor their memories to. The winter the canyon slid, or the year the drought broke. And because they are so rare, scientists have only 3 of them to learn from, which is almost nothing. We are trying to forecast a 4th event from a sample of 3, and a sample of 3 is barely enough to draw a line through. That is part of why the honest forecast carries so much uncertainty. and part of why a country that has not faced one of these in a decade is walking into it with its guard down. And the honest picture has two sides. The careful, official estimate from the Climate Prediction Center gives this event roughly a 37% chance of reaching that super category. That is not a prediction that it happens. It is a strong, maybe better than 1 in 3. But several independent analyses, run by scientists outside the agencies, looked at the same ocean and came away more alarmed, with some putting the odds of a super event closer to 63% by autumn. And at the far edge of the model range, a handful of simulations show this becoming the strongest El Niño since reliable records began around 1950. That is not the most likely outcome, but it is in the room, so everyone agrees it is coming. The cautious voices say there is roughly a 1 in 3 chance it becomes a monster. The bolder voices say a monster is the most likely single result, and nobody can tell you for certain, because the peak strength of one of these events cannot be known until it actually peaks, which will not happen until late this year, most likely around December. That is not a flaw in the forecast. That is the forecast. And it is exactly why the country should be paying attention now, because the difference between the low end and the high end of that range is the difference between a winter America shrugs off and a winter it remembers for a generation. El Niño's grip on the United States is strongest in winter, and the first thing it does is split the country in two. When the Central Pacific warms, it strengthens a branch of the jet stream called the subtropical jet and aims it like a fire hose at the southern half of the country. That is the mechanism behind everything that follows. The storms that would normally scatter get organized and funneled along a southern track, and the odds tilt, sometimes heavily, toward a wetter, stormier, more dangerous southern tier from California, across the southwest, along the Gulf Coast, through the southeast, and into Florida. Nowhere does that hit harder than California. When that strengthened jet aims at the west coast, it does not just bring rain. It brings atmospheric rivers, ribbons of concentrated water vapor thousands of miles long that can each carry as much water as a major river, except suspended in the sky, until they slam into the mountains and ring out all at once. In a strong El Niño, these do not arrive one at a time. They come in convoys, one after another, each one stacking its rainfall on ground already saturated by the last. That is how California goes from drought to flood in a matter of weeks, and how hillsides stripped bare by past wildfires suddenly turn to mud and slide. The danger of a super event is not a single storm. It is the conveyor belt that never lets the ground drain. And this is where California's whole way of life gets tested, because the state is built around the assumption of long, dry summers and short, wet winters, with an enormous system of dams and reservoirs designed to catch the winter water and ration it out across the rainless months. A super El Niño can shove that system to either extreme. In a year when the storm track aims true, California can take in a huge share of its entire annual water budget in a handful of weeks, refilling reservoirs that took years to drain while at the same time overwhelming the rivers and flood control systems that were never built for that much water that fast. The same event that ends a drought can drown the infrastructure meant to manage it, and that is exactly the kind of double-edged outcome the country is not prepared to absorb. Follow that southern storm track east, and the same hand touches the rest of the bottom of the country. The desert southwest, the Gulf Coast, the southeast, and Florida all see the odds tilt wetter and stormier. But the same pattern that threatens one region rescues another. For 6 straight years, a punishing drought has gripped the southern plains, draining reservoirs and cracking farmland across Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. There are very few weather patterns on Earth capable of breaking a drought that deep. A strong El Niño winter, aiming that storm track right across the parched plains for months, is one of them. So the same Pacific warming that endangers California could be the thing that finally saves the southern plains. That is the two-faced nature of this signal, and it is exactly why no single headline can capture it. While the South drowns, the North dries out. The same shift that aims storms at the southern tier tends to pull the northern storm track back, leaving the top half of the country milder and drier, from the Pacific Northwest across the northern plains and the upper Midwest to the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley. The brutal, deep cold those regions brace for shows up less often. For a lot of people, that sounds like good news, and in the short term, it often is. There is a catch worth stating plainly, because people get it wrong, and it can be dangerous. A milder than average winter does not mean a winter with no cold in it. It means the odds are tilted toward warmth across the season as a whole. It does not switch off the possibility of a brutal cold snap in any given week, and some El Niño winters have delivered memorable snowstorms in the middle of an overall mild season. So the mistake to avoid is reading a mild outlook as permission to stop preparing for winter, because the season can be warm on balance and still bury a city for a week in January. El Niño leans the odds. It does not repeal winter. But the Pacific Northwest is where that mild winter hides a real problem. The entire water supply of the region is built on the snowpack that piles up in the mountains over winter and melts out slowly through the dry summer. It is a savings account made of snow. In a strong El Niño, the Northwest runs warmer, with higher freezing levels, which means more rain than snow, a thin mountain snowpack, and a short snow season. You can have a pleasant, low-drama winter up there and still walk into summer with a water shortage and a heightened fire risk. Because the danger was never the cold. It was the snow that never came. And then there is the piece that matters most to the tens of millions of people on the hurricane coast, because for once it points toward relief. El Niño suppresses the Atlantic hurricane season. When the Pacific warms, it cranks up the wind shear over the tropical Atlantic, and hurricanes cannot survive strong shear, which rips their structure apart before they can organize. You can already see this baked into the official forecast. The government's 2026 Atlantic outlook calls for a below-average season, roughly 8 to 14 named storms, 3 to 6 hurricanes, and only 1 to 3 major ones, and one of the most respected forecasting teams in the country lowered its numbers and pointed straight at the strengthening El Niño. But the relief comes with a cost somewhere else. Because the energy does not vanish, it relocates. The same conditions that calm the Atlantic tend to energize the Pacific, where typhoons can run stronger and supply chains the whole world depends on take the hit. The planet does not get a break. It gets a redistribution. So now you have the whole American map. The South gets the water, California gets the rivers and the sky, the Southern Plains might get saved, the North goes mild and dry, the Atlantic goes quiet. It is a clean, predictable pattern. And if I stopped here, you would think we have this figured out. But that confidence is the trap. And the only way to see why is to look at the 3 times this has actually happened. Because every one of them broke the map I just drew you. America has exactly 3 reference points for what a super El Niño does. And they are the only evidence we have. The first was the winter of 1982 and 83, the strongest of the century at the time. The trade winds did not just weaken, they collapsed and reversed. And the consequences spread across nearly every continent, with drought and fire in Australia and Indonesia, and record flooding in Peru. It was blamed for close to 2,000 deaths and more than $13 billion in damage, with roughly $4.1 trillion in losses to the global economy over the following 5 years. It arrived as an ambush, before the modern forecasting tools existed. The second is the one American forecasters study the most, the winter of 1997 and 98, the El Niño of the century. It produced the second warmest and 7th wettest American winter since record-keeping began in 1895, drove a relentless convoy of storms into California, Texas, and the Gulf Coast, and was tied to roughly $5.7 trillion in global income losses. That winter is the closest thing we have to a preview of a super El Niño hitting the United States at full force. And those dollar figures are not just the cost of one bad winter. A landmark economic study found that a strong El Niño drags down national economies not only during the event, but for years afterward, a shadow that stretches roughly half a decade past the last storm through lost harvests, stalled productivity, and entire economies knocked off their stride. That is the scale of what a super event actually costs. And it falls hardest on the places least able to absorb it. The third is the most recent, the winter of 2015 and 16, and it carries the most important warning of all. By temperature, it was a true monster, peaking around 2.4 degrees above normal, setting a global heat record and driving a record 16 tropical cyclones in the northern Pacific. And going into it, The entire country was told to expect California to be drenched. The drought finally broken. The storms largely missed. California sat under one of the strongest El Niños ever recorded and got a fraction of what was promised, and the drought ground on. The dice were loaded as heavily as they have ever been, and the ocean rolled them anyway and came up a different number. That is the lesson underneath this whole story. Even a genuine monster does not guarantee any single region the outcome the map predicts. Here's the part almost no headline mentions, and it is the reason America may be less ready than it thinks. This El Niño is forming in the warmest ocean ever recorded in human history. Every previous super event developed in a cooler world. This one is layering its warm signal on top of a global ocean that is already running near record warmth, with nearly the entire tropical and northern Pacific warmer than normal before the event has even fully arrived. That matters because the El Niño signal works by standing out against its surroundings. And the surroundings are now hot too. We just ran this experiment by accident. A study published in January of 2026 found that the typical impacts of the most recent El Niño, the one in 2023 and 24, were partly canceled out by all the extra warm water elsewhere in the oceans, meaning the textbook patterns did not show up cleanly. One scientist put the implication bluntly, saying that climate change has made past El Niños less informative for events today. The three maps America relies on may be losing their resolution at exactly the moment the country needs to read them. There is one thing the warm background does not blur. A strong to super El Niño dumps an enormous quantity of stored ocean heat into the atmosphere, which makes a new global temperature record close to certain. The lagged peak usually lands the year after the event, which puts 2027 in line to become the hottest year ever measured, surpassing the record set in 2023. So what do you actually watch over the coming months? First, watch that index cross positive 0.5, which it almost certainly will within weeks, confirming El Niño has officially arrived. Then watch how fast it climbs. A steady, accelerating rise through the summer and into autumn is the fingerprint of an event heading for the super category, and the major forecasting centers sharpen their strength estimates dramatically by October and November, when the wide range we are living with now collapses toward a clear answer. And then watch the storm track as winter approaches. Does the subtropical jet set up and aim at the southern tier the way it should? Do the atmospheric rivers start lining up on California? Because the lesson of 2015 and 16 is that the ocean can be a monster, and the storm track can still set up just far enough off the mark to spare a region, or to spare nothing. That placement is the detail that decides whether this delivers its full weight or surprises everyone again. Here is the bottom line. A strong, possibly super El Niño is no longer a question of if, only how strong, and its hand will fall hardest on America this coming fall and winter. The South should prepare for water and flood risk, the Northwest should watch its snowpack, and the hurricane coast can cautiously exhale. But the country has exactly 3 maps for a super event. Every one of them delivered a surprise, and this one is forming on an ocean unlike any of them. We will know how strong it gets by December. We will know what it actually does to America by spring. And the smartest thing anyone can do right now is stop assuming the last El Niño tells you what the next one will be, because this time, it may not.